Hello, and welcome to CHEE Chat, the chess podcast where we talk with our professors to learn more about them and the chemical engineering field in general. I'm your host, Gregory Brock, the VP Academic of Chess, and today, for our second episode, we will be talking with Anne-Marie Keitzig. Hello, everyone. My name is Gregory Brock, and welcome to our podcast, CHEE Chat. So this is for the second episode, and we are super excited to welcome Professor Keitzig. So if you mind just introducing yourself, that'd be fantastic.
Well, thank you, Gregory. Well, thanks for having me, for setting that up, and just doing something different than having classes and trying to deal with this virtual world. Well, as you just said, my name is Anne Keitzig. I've been at McGill since 2010. Yeah. I don't quite know what you want me to further say.
So don't worry, we'll get into it. First of all, I guess just before we even get into the current situation, how has your sort of experience of being at McGill as a professor, how has that sort of evolved since you've been here, and then for the 10 years that that's sort of been continuing on? Like, what was it like in the beginning, and then sort of how has that changed to now?
That's a good question. It's an interesting question. So I guess when I first started, super new, young, idealistic assistant professor, that I came straight from my PhD. So I didn't do a postdoc before. So if you want, so I was somewhat naive. Starting off, I experienced a lot of help from the department, from colleagues. From the beginning, I absolutely enjoyed teaching. The first course I was teaching was chemical reaction engineering, which I'm teaching now again, which is definitely one of my favorite courses. And so I think it was, fairly stressful when you start off. You have to ramp up a lab. You have to figure out how everything runs. You have to know whom to ask which question, because everybody has all that experience, but it's nowhere documented. Like, you guys have a handbook. We didn't really get something like a handbook, like, okay, this is what you have to do in your first 3 weeks when you're an assistant professor. It's more like, okay, I somehow have to write grants, and I somehow have to set up a lab, and I have to hire students, but where do I start with all of that?
It's like, where do you even begin with it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit, I think that was daunting at the beginning. And then, you don't think about it. You just go ahead and you try to make ends meet, and you just try to figure it out as you go along, and you make mistakes, and you realize it shortly after, or a long time after, you should have done certain things a bit differently. I think what was a great help back then was that another assistant professor who's not with the department anymore, but she had started 2 or 3 years ahead of me, and I have started together with Professor Ghostic, who also isn't around anymore. Like, he's in Waterloo now. But so we were two. So you kind of have someone to go to.
There was that sort of community for you then, right?
If you want, so exactly. So just like, I don't know how to do that. Do you? No, but well, at least let's go
we
for
can
a beer
figure it out together.
Exactly.
I think that's really interesting, because I find that that's often analogous to the experience of students in a way. I mean, obviously there's like very obvious differences, but I find that the one thing that has always been the most helpful to me as a student going through ChemEng was the experience of having older students and having it's not a pedagogy, but it's just a sort of people passing down this information in like
the little tricks, the little ideas, just like, hey, here, you're better off studying this and that way, or here, you're better off keeping track of this and that.
Sort of to bring that question into the modern day. I asked about what your experiences were like and how they've evolved, but how have you been dealing with the current situation? Obviously, between the pandemic and everything else that's been happening, I'm just curious to see what it's been like for your own sort of personal routine, how you're teaching classes, how everything's sort of going around like that.
Maybe you should ask my students. Well, I think I'd say we've gotten into a beat. I would definitely say that first class in September, I haven't been as nervous before a class since I had started teaching, which is far before I had started teaching at McGill, because it was just like, okay, I have 3 screens, I have like 10 applications, I don't see my students, I don't have direct feedback. It felt very overwhelming. And I think as the semester went on, at least we got a bit into the routine. I know on which screen I have to place what. I know how to find my references there again. So I think that that aspect we figured out, but in addition to, okay, you need to concentrate on the material, and you know the material super well, so you definitely don't have to be nervous about teaching the material.
Mhm.
The IT side made it fairly intimidating.
Yeah.
And I still have to say, I'm not a big fan of teaching online. I mean, we basically teach to a black box. I can ask ever so often, can you please switch on your videos? And if I'm lucky, I have 5, 6.
Yeah.
Yesterday I was unlucky and I had 2. So these are the 2 students that I try to orient or pace myself at. And what I've noticed the last couple of weeks is, everybody's getting tired with the semester rolling on. There are less and less videos being switched on. We have, when we stand in a classroom, even though I might not have 60 people talking to me, I see faces and I see what people do. Are they on their phone? Are they still scribbling something down? Do they look completely puzzled? Do they talk to their neighbor, trying to understand what I've just been saying? And I can read faces and I can address what I think might be the problem here right now. Now I'm talking to my screen and I have 2 students that I take as a reference, but they might be completely off towards the rest, the majority of the rest of the class. So I think that is a challenge. Other than that, I mean, there are like funny situations. Last Wednesday, my daughter was sick.
Yeah.
And so I was teaching with her on my lap, and she was super nice because she was considering half an hour class, she was relatively quiet. And at some point she figured out that she's seeing herself and she started pointing at the screen. So I was trying to concentrate on my topic. I saw my students who were smiling because they saw her pointing at different things. She knew she wasn't allowed to talk. So it's little situations like that that just make it very funny, like where you're just like, okay, now reset. What was I talking about? I was talking about reactors. And so it's little things like that where, well, you realize that we're not machines, we're not robots, right? Like we're all trying to keep up with that pace somehow. Well, I definitely prefer to teach from university than teaching from home because the hours don't really work with family life.
One thing I actually did want to get into as well, though, is that you talk about how you didn't do a postdoc, you went directly from your PhD into starting to teach. I wanted to know a bit more about sort of your education experience before becoming a teacher.
Like really going back, I did my undergrad in Berlin, in Germany.
Yeah.
So I think I was, I don't know, 2 or 3 semesters, years. My third year, I think it was. They were short TAs and like really short TAs. And I had just finished that one course. I studied chemical engineering and economics, management a bit in parallel. And so it was that microeconomics course where they needed TAs for. And I applied because, well, it's a fun experience. And I think I was 22 or 23 at that point, and ended up in front of a classroom with 150 of my kind of peers, some of them who had started before me. And I was supposed to give them a tutorial. And that was like, I think it still counts to my most daunting tasks as a teacher. That was the beginning of, and I did, my teaching career, if you want so. I didn't have any pedagogical education. It was more like, okay, you've taken that course, you're good in that course, teach the others here the tutorial problems.
Trial by fire.
Exactly, kind of like that. Well, overall, it went really well. I can't complain. And I enjoyed the experience. I enjoyed the experience of trying to explain to others what I seem to know. And then realizing that, oh yeah, maybe they think differently than I do. And you can approach the problem from another perspective. But that was basically my first teaching experience. After my undergrad, I went to Vancouver. I did my PhD in Vancouver. And so at UBC. And well, I don't know where you were in 2010 for the Winter Olympics. But
I was watching them.
You were watching them? Well, I was watching them too, but I was watching them actually.
Oh my gosh. My mom would be so jealous of you. My mom loves the Winter Olympics. Well, she loves all the Olympics, but specifically the Winter Olympics. She's also from Quebec, so she's super into all of the all of the sports that year.
Exactly. So basically my PhD project was linked to the Winter Olympics. So it was, in rough terms, it was aimed towards making ice sports faster. That is the, vulgarized version of the PhD that considers ice friction.
Yeah.
And so I've been working with basically all ice sports, especially bobsleigh, skeleton, not so much. Yeah, bobsleigh, skeleton were the main sliding sports, and then speed skating, short track and long track.
Yeah.
So working with the athletes there, so that was a lot of fun. But working with athletes is not all to it, right? Like a PhD, you usually do in the lab, and you do it with instrumentation and very rigorous experimentation. And well, that is what led to the publications. But when I had applied for this position at McGill, it was in 2009, I think in the spring, because my supervisors had pushed me to apply for a faculty position, and I felt too young, too naive, didn't want to do, like, I basically wanted to do postdoc somewhere. I didn't really want to worry about it because I wanted to participate passively, not as an athlete, but at least as a volunteer in the Winter Olympics, where I had worked and I had gotten to know a lot of the athletes throughout my PhD. So nevertheless, they convinced me. I applied. They wanted me to apply in Edmonton. And I knew Edmonton, and I didn't want to go to Edmonton because I didn't like the city. And so I was just like, I went to my office and was like, okay, they absolutely want me to apply to somewhere. So where do I apply to? At least to a place that I could imagine going. But I had a couple, several friends who had applied to very many universities for faculty position that were much older than I was. And, they were super happy if after 20 applications, they got one interview. Yeah. So I really didn't count my chances high, but I more wanted to basically satisfy my supervisors. I have applied somewhere, they will leave me alone.
So this is on a whim then?
It was a bit of a different experience. So actually, one of my supervisors was also the supervisor of Professor Servio. And well, I knew that at that time, but that time was on vacation. I got an email and a phone call from McGill, and then I was invited to come here for the interview. And well, I went, but not with high hopes, more with like, okay, I'll spend a weekend in Montreal and see what a faculty interview will be like. And well, obviously it worked out at that point. So at that point, I didn't have my PhD yet. I had not defended my PhD yet. And at that time, the chair was Professor Burke, and I negotiated that I would only start after the Winter Olympics. I would not come before the Winter Olympics. So that was the little anecdote around that. I profited from the Winter Olympics, and then I came.
So something I was also curious about is that as someone who obviously you did your undergrad in Germany, you did your undergrad in Berlin, and then now you're teaching for undergrad in Canada, what are the sort of differences that you see between the two systems? Like, I'm just curious to see, like, do you see any sort of like things that you consider pros in one system versus cons in the other?
Well, there's a third dimension that's coming into that question, because one is time. I mean, I'm not the oldest among your professors, but nevertheless, I'm probably 20 years older than some of you. So I guess there's a fundamental difference between the two systems, because education is free in Germany. So you don't, you pay like maybe $300 tuition fees, which basically counts for your sports pass and your metro pass and well, subsidy for the canteen, but basically do not pay for your education. And that makes that classes are much, much bigger. Like I had my introductory classes easily with several thousands of students. So the first 3 years, you were basically fighting for your place to sit in a lecture. Like it happened that you came in too late and you were sitting on stairs. It happened that you came in and you were not in the room where the professor was, but you were another one where there was a video projection. So you can imagine how much you actually gained from that lecture. So we actually went to the lectures more for the social experience with the friends than necessarily learn a lot. It depended on the professors. We had some that were excellent and we had some that were, maybe not as great. If there would have been a recording, listening to the recording would have probably been more efficient. So I think there was a big difference in the first 2-3 years of that, what we discussed earlier, the student-professor relationship, because basically there was none. Like the professor is somewhere, on his throne behind a secretary who's like a dragon. So you don't necessarily pass her easily and get to see your professor. So I think that is a big difference in the system. And then, as I said earlier, you had to fight for your place in lab courses and the like. There were not enough for all the students. So if you don't take it this year, well, then you take it next year. but there's no one that assures you that you will have a place. Like either you manage to get into that course or you don't. And if they're full, they're full. So it's a bit more survival of the fittest. Also, the failure rates in math and statistics, they were 80%, 85%. So you were super happy if you just passed that course.
When I was actually applying to universities, that was actually somewhat similar to the reputation that I heard for McGill, actually, where it's like comparative to a lot of, because I'm from the States, I'm from the United States, and comparative to a lot of the universities there, they were talking about how they're like, oh, McGill, for people from the States, McGill is like considered like pretty prestigious to go into. But they were also talking about, they were like, oh, like class sizes are relatively large, so you need to make sure that you're able to advocate for yourself. You're also going to have to make sure that like courses there are considered like pretty difficult, especially for first year. Like you need to make sure that you're able to study on your own because they're not going to hold your hand. So I think it's interesting because I think even as much as there is that differential between what you're talking about for your experiences in Germany versus what's here, I think that there even exists a bit of that differential for what's here versus a lot of schools in the States. Because I think that when you have to pay, honestly, the exorbitant fees that you do for schools in the States, I think that you sort of expect now that you're going to be in smaller class sizes, that they're going to organize things for you. So I think
Yeah,
it's
you have
interesting.
service and help and
Yeah.
assistance.
They're
Yeah,
like,
so
well,
I think that's definitely a big difference. I mean, I remember my organic chemistry classes where we had, you got a vial with some substance and you had to analyze
yeah.
and figure out what's in there.
Hmm.
You would figure out like a hell of a lot what could possibly have been in there because the glassware was never clean. So, it's little things like that. I mean, today I'm laughing about that, but that is not something that you would see here.
Yeah, definitely.
At the same time, once we reached, at that time, I still did a diploma. They didn't have the bachelor and master system
Mhm.
when I studied yet. It's introduced now, but it wasn't at that time. So what has been converted into a bachelor and master's, I've done all in the framework of a diploma.
Yeah.
And so once we had passed the first 2 years, 3 years basically, classes became smaller because a lot of people had dropped out. And we established a bit more of a student-teacher relationship. Classes now shrank to maybe 80 students, and a bit more the class sizes you're familiar with.
Mhm.
And you started to get to know the professors. Professors started to get to know you.
Mhm.
I think one other big comparison that I would like to bring up, and that is somewhat interesting in the current situation, is we had in my last years as an undergrad, I had lots and lots of oral exams.
Mhm.
So there were those written exams, but they were basically just, you had to pass them to be admitted to the oral exam. They didn't count towards anything.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
was that one big oral exam that covered 3 semesters of content. For example, if you want so somewhat phys-chem and reaction engineering principles, that was 3 semesters. And at the end of those 3 semesters, you had one oral exam that took 45 minutes, you with your prof and another prof, and you would be grilled alone on the topic of any content that would have been covered in those 3 years. So it was the extreme contrast to what we're doing presently, where we have
Mhm.
like, 20 different small
Yeah.
evaluations. It was a super high stakes exam, super stressful because you studied only for that course for like 2
Mhm.
months nonstop. You did nothing else. At the same time, because it was a personal, like an in-person exam, you didn't want to leave a bad impression, and grades were very high because you studied so much that you were certain that you will not embarrass yourself
Not
in
only did
that.
you know the answer forward, you knew it backward as well, sort of.
Yeah, kind of. So you like, me and my friends, we ended up having very good grades, but not necessarily because we studied a lot, but not only because we wanted to have a good grade, but also because we didn't want to be embarrassed.
Well, because
So
especially because you mentioned how there's so many people in each of those classes that, or is that when you had the smaller classes as
that
well?
was that's towards the
Yeah.
end. That was
But
really the
even,
last 2 years.
yeah, even then though, too, when you're going into it, it's like that's one of, if not your first interactions with your prof, definitely one of the interactions with your prof that leads to the biggest sort of impact. So
Definitely.
you don't want to be that person who messes up the oral exam at the end because
No,
then you're just like, oh, the prof thinks that I'm like, not that they, I don't think the
exactly.
profs would think that you're necessarily like
No, they do that 100 times a
Yeah.
semester, right? Like, so they are used to that.
Yeah,
But I
definitely.
think instead of what we do a lot of marking in front of a
Yeah.
screen or off paper. They were doing that in person. So you
Yeah.
can discuss how comparable one exam is to the other, of course. That's a whole different story. But I think that is a big difference that in my case definitely led to me being responsible for my own learning and my studying, but also doing a lot of hours, and probably too many, on passing that freaking exam.
Yeah, definitely. No, actually, something I was also curious about is that I was curious to see, as someone who's been in Chem Eng and has had so much education and sort of experience in it, how has your understanding of what chemical engineering is? How has that sort of evolved over time? And if you could say like one thing to yourself as an undergrad, is there any one thing that you'd want to say?
That's a good question. I think, maybe like many of you, I started off in that course of studies, not necessarily for the reason because I knew what a chemical engineer would do. Like, to be honest, I think when I was 18, 19, I had no clue. And I picked that course of studies for maybe other reasons. And then getting into it, yes, it's based upon math and chemistry and physics and kind of the subjects we're good at school. And this is why we chose that course of studies. I think the big thing that I like to tell myself, or that my career maybe shows a little bit, my research is in applied physics.
Yeah.
I am doing laser micromachining of surfaces.
Mm-hmm.
My last official physics class dates back to grade 11 at high school. I've never studied physics in an educational setting other than high school. So I never took a physics class, never took an optics class. I'm completely self-trained in that. That's definitely a disadvantage very many times. But it also shows you that as a chemical engineer, we have a very broad basis. And I think more than any other engineer does. And once you figure out what you really like or what interests you, you have the basics to pass into that direction. And I think my own career path is a bit an example of that. I diverted off into a direction that interested me, that fits, that came with the circumstances, but was not necessarily based 100% on the core curriculum of a chemical engineer. Nevertheless, everything that I learned became very, very useful for me, and it's still today. So I think if I would say something to my former self, very often I thought like, oh, I should have studied mechanical engineering instead, or, hardcore physics, because I would have better basics in some of the subjects that I need a lot. And I would have had an easier time in getting that knowledge. At the same time, I had enough of the fundamentals to go into one direction or another. And I probably have an advantage there now in comparison to having studied physics, like pure physics, that I have the understanding of the physics, but I can also read a CAD drawing. So I think that's, if you ask me about the core message, that's basically, I think the chemical engineering undergrad has that big advantage that you can divert into any direction that you think is important, and you've learned a lot of fundamentals that then you can apply. And it's not important that you remember equation XYZ. You don't have to remember it, but you have learned how to derive it, or how to possibly where to go and where to find the stepping stones to get where you want to get.
Well, the way that I sort of view it as well, and obviously I'm still going through my undergrad, so I'm not going to pretend like I know all the answers by any means. But the way that I sort of have taken to viewing it is that I'm not learning a job, I'm learning a toolkit that I can then apply how I want. And I think that a lot of people get really stressed out by graduating from chemical engineering and feeling like it's vague almost, because of the fact that they feel like they should have one skill set that applies to what they want to do, and then they should look for jobs in there. But then for me, I don't know, I feel like that same sort of feeling that makes people think that it's vague is actually kind of a strength of the job, because of the fact, or is kind of a strength of the degree because of the fact that it gives you such a wide skill set.
Absolutely. And if you look at where, your peers that have graduated, where they end up in, it's all kinds of industries. It's all kinds of yeah, career path.
Hmm.
And I'd like to say that I think as a department or as a discipline, we succeed nevertheless in in building that fundamental basis,
Yeah.
and those enforcing those ideas of creativity and ingenuity,
Hmm.
that you can then, pull off from, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree with that. So actually something that we definitely glanced on this a bit before, but if you could just delve a bit further into your research, you do a lot of work in biomimetic surface engineering, if I'm not mistaken. But if you could just delve a little bit into that just to let our listeners know, that'd be fantastic.
So I'll step back a bit because I've been
Hmm.
talking about the Olympics before.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
basically, one of the challenges there in my PhD was, okay, make ice skates faster on ice.
Hmm.
And so we looked into, okay, ice skates or any sliders on ice are usually made out of metal. How do you get metal to be non-adhering to water or to
Hmm.
ice? At that time back, I read an article about the lotus leaf. You might have heard about it. It's basically super hydrophobic leaf, kind of most likely your raincoat and your Gore-Tex boots are modeled after it,
Hmm.
because they are very water repellent, and that is the property that that leaf has. And it was at about that time, 2005, 7, when the first research on that came out. And microscopic images of that lotus leaf have shown that the surface pattern is of such particular structure that it traps air and repels water.
Hmm.
And it was at that point that I had read that article that mentioned, oh, we can imitate that by laser machining, by laser micromachining. And at about the same time, femtosecond lasers, so really fast pulsed, ultra fast lasers, had come out. I happened to find one on the campus of UBC. And I got into touch with those people from chemistry and was just like, well, I would like to try that out. My supervisor had let me free hands with respect to, okay, you want to do something, like you figure out your means and you try it out. And if it works, it works. Well, it ended
Hmm.
up working. So we machined those microstructures, micro nanostructures on metallic surfaces. And that's in the end still what I'm doing today in maybe a bit more sophisticated way than 15 years ago,
Hmm.
14 years ago. Um, what we're trying to do is taking inspiration from natural surfaces. And I've given the lotus leaf as the most prominent example, but there are many more. Nature surfaces are functional.
Hmm.
They might be, completely wetting, completely non-wetting, breathable, not breathable. Like some species can diffuse through, others can't. They are highly, like if you take a shell, for example, you can walk on it. It will not crack, it will not break. So extremely tough materials, extremely soft materials, self-healing materials, etc. Like the list is endless. And nature does so without a high consumption of energy, natural resources. And most importantly, at the end of the life, all those natural surfaces biodegrade.
Yeah.
Now, if we're trying to solve like problems as engineers, the traditional engineers, now I'm saying like, let's go back 50 to 100 years. What do we do? Temperature, pressure, and lots of resources.
Yeah.
That's the typical way of addressing engineering problems. So I'm a bit, well, passionate about the idea of doing it differently and trying to see how nature is solving alike problems that we face in technological circumstances.
Yeah.
And this is a bit where my research fits in. So we've expanded from metals to polymers to ceramics. We basically try to get functional surfaces by influencing the nano and microscopic surface texture.
I think that's really interesting as well because there's an interesting way where I think that sort of applies to a lot of this movement for increased sort of green engineering, I guess you could say, where it's sort of that this sort of traditional approach of just throwing a bunch of resources at something using pressure, using these high energy sort of like using a bunch of energy and a bunch of resources. I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that that may not necessarily be the most sustainable way of creating solutions to things. And so I think there's a bunch of, I mean, beyond just the research that you're doing, I think there's a bunch of looking into like biomimicry and other things like that because there are already these efficient solutions that are created in nature. Um, So it's like you might as well see what you can from them and try to adopt them to the systems that we're looking at.
Exactly.
Mhm,
Exactly. So that is, well, that's pretty much what the technical complementary that I'm teaching is all about.
mhm.
But
I might have to take it.
yeah,
Great.
you definitely would.
Um,
No, that's what we're trying to do in that course as well. Usually I'm co-teaching it with a
mhm,
professor from mining and materials. This year she's teaching the majority of this course and I'm taking a smaller role in there.
mhm.
Next year will be the opposite way again.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm taking the perspective a bit more from the physical standpoint, and she is looking at it a bit more from the chemical perspective.
Mhm.
But in the end, that's the idea. It's all these engineering problems that we have, be it heat transfer, mass transfer, and so on, is already done in our plants, in, you know, a cat walking around outside, in our skin, in our own body, if we look at our intestines or what's not. So we can adopt a lot of these ideas or those principles and maybe transfer them to our typical industrial engineering big scale problems.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the sort of the scale up of, because a lot of these solutions, like a lot of these solutions exist on like a lab based level, but I think the scale up part where engineers really get involved is going to be one of the huge things that we really have to work towards ironing out the details of, because
Exactly.
the perfect thing can exist, but if it only works in a lab on microscopic scales, it doesn't, like, we need to have things actually be applied on larger levels.
Exactly. So that's a
Yeah.
bit where I see the niche for laser machining, because
Mhm.
you can do very small scale stuff without having the vacuum reactor, without having the lithography system,
Mhm.
without having the, you know, nasty chemical etching that is absolutely perfect and works very, very well for microchips. But if you want to make an airplane wing, you don't deal with the same surface.
So something I was curious to see is so the technique for the metal blades, that was the through the Own the Podium initiative, right?
Exactly.
Perfect, perfect. And so I was just curious to see like uh, from what I can see, because I actually have I do have an article pulled up on it. I just saw it actually. It seems like it didn't make the cut, unfortunately, for those Olympics, but do you know how it sort of applied, how it's been applied in the time since?
I do and I don't. So
Okay.
there's a big portion that has been included and applied, and I can't talk about it
Yeah.
for, I guess, obvious reasons.
Yeah.
We have collaborated, for example, with the bobsled team again in the last couple of years.
Mhm.
So there's been kind of continuing consulting going on. Like, you know, once you have trust of people and you have a relationship established, you continue working with it. One experience that was very interesting in working with athletes or sports associations, in contrast to working with engineers, is that you need to get that buy-in. And that was a big hurdle, because sports and athletes work a lot by, I have always done it that way, so this is why I'm doing it, because I have confidence in it, I will
Yeah.
perform well. Now you come with a revolutionary technique, you need someone to buy in.
Yeah. And when they hear
And
revolutionary, they hear new, and that's sort of that might be a difficult
exactly.
challenge
So
for them.
that was at the time quite tricky.
Mhm.
Certain things, as I said, have been implemented,
Yeah.
and it was especially because in certain sports we had coaches, individual athletes that were more progressive than others and that
Mhm.
really wanted to push something.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the buy-in of this or that person, you don't necessarily have the engineering background behind, so that you can come with your equations and say, hey, look at that equation, this is why it works better. um, you will not
Yeah.
get there.
Yeah. And more than just that, sometimes even if they have the background, they're just like, yeah, it could theoretically work that well, but what if I fall because it's a new, so I guess there's always that sort of, there is always that concern, I guess, in the back too.
Exactly, exactly.
Mhm.
So there's, as I said, like a lot has been implemented with bobsleigh as well.
Yeah.
um, Again, I can't talk about the details, because that's
Confidential.
all, and the non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think the key part all along, and that is, I think, for many of the jobs that you later on will be in as well, is to
Oh,
get
knock
the
on wood.
buy-in. And when you're
Yeah.
talking to someone who might not be from an engineering background, but maybe a management background, or maybe some, you know, completely different background, it's getting that first buy-in is not easy. But once you have it, then you have a relationship for a very long time.
Going beyond, I guess, just the Winter Olympics, I was also curious to see there was this article that you didn't write, but you had some commentary on that I thought was really interesting. And you talked about how there was biomimicry in a fly's wings that prevents bacteria from staying on it. So I was curious to see, to what degree do you think that sort of biomimetic surfaces that are antibacterial or antiviral, especially in a post-COVID world, what degree or what place do you think that they might have in sort of preventing future pandemics or infection?
Well, if you look a bit further, then
Hmm.
you might know, you might have heard that, for example, U of T, well, actually together with a professor from materials engineering as well, they have developed a coating, a copper coating that is biocidal. So basically kills bacteria and
Yeah.
viruses upon contact or shortly after that.
Hmm.
A bit more on the chemical basis than on the physical basis. And what you refer to is the cicada wing that has little spikes that disrupt bacteria and basically fracture it and kill
Hmm.
it, therefore. I think there's a big interest in that, but I don't think that, I think that interest has been out there before, because we have applied like research, and research in these fields has been active in the last 10 years already. Once we had the microscopy facilities or abilities to look that far down into the nanoscale to actually understand how natural mechanisms act and how they work, um, efforts have been out there to apply that to hospital surfaces,
Wow.
um, high infectious,
Hmm.
like environments where we're really concerned about it. So I think that has been there anyways. The interest has increased with COVID, but
Hmm.
here we also have to be careful because there's a lot of literature coming out and a lot of research coming out that is not properly carried out, not properly screened, not properly peer reviewed. And we've seen that a lot in the past 8, 9 months,
Yeah.
where well, publications and announcements regarding these aspects have really exploded, even though there's not necessarily something super new about it, because people in that field have been working on that for a while.
Hmm.
So there's definitely more interest, I think, and now there's definitely more funding,
Hmm.
especially post-COVID. I think there's more funding going into infection prevention.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure if it will really revolutionize that approach, because it has been there before and it has been applied also before. It just didn't get the media attention
Yeah.
that we have right now.
So now it's sort of just like we're like everyone's sort of coming to it, but they're sort of late to the party because all of these things we've already sort of have the basis for it in a lot of
Exactly. Like if you take, I think it was a few weeks ago where there was a face mask, some copper particles or something on
yeah.
there, claiming to have, very good antiviral, antibacterial properties. If you think of, the a bit more expensive socks that you
Yeah.
buy at the Bay or wherever,
Hmm.
they have silver particles in there for the past 10 years. And it has been there. We
Yeah.
know that, but it just didn't make the headlines of the newspapers.
Well, because now
So
it's not preventing like now people are starting to apply it to the new sort of thing. So it's old
exactly, but
technology.
the technology has been there. We know that nanoparticles of certain metals
Yeah.
have that ability, that activity,
Hmm.
and now just being applied to something that's in the news every single day.
One thing as well is that we talk a lot about the benefits of sort of reproducing some patterns or some aspects of nature, but do you think that there are any limitations in that sort of burgeoning field? Because it's something that necessarily there's more studying going into it. Have there been any sort of ways where you've seen where it notably can't meet demand or it can't solve this problem? Like what are problems that it can't necessarily address, do you think?
Well, I think that's the big difference between biomimetics,
Hmm.
where mimetic means, okay, we try to copy something, and
Yeah.
bioinspiration,
Yeah.
where we take inspiration from biology and then we
Hmm.
take it to the next level.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you take some plant that grows here in Canada, then the same solution might not work for this exact same plant.
Hmm.
If we bring it, I don't know, to Brazil, for example, it will like die. So nature has established to, or has found its way to live in a particular environment. And many of our problems involve much harsher conditions and much more drastic changes in conditions than what a natural species would live or see in its habitat. So obviously directly copying one solution and sticking it like a band-aid on a problem will not necessarily work. And this is why I think, you know, instead of only copying, we have to go further and we have to take inspiration. And that is then where the ingenuity comes in. Transform that solution into something that's viable also now in different environments, under different operating temperatures, and different, well, lifetime as well. We generally have the expectation that a solution that we come up with has to work for 20 years or something like that. There are not that many species that will have, without regenerating itself, let's take a leaf or something, a leaf on the lotus will not live for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very important to leave things in its own perspective and extrapolate rather than say, oh, here, I found the, you know, the magic solution for everything.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting because I almost think it's how it's almost how coding oftentimes works. Not to draw like a weird parallel, but for a lot of people with coding, what they'll do is that they'll see the logic of something that they saw online, and it's not about copy pasting what they saw online. It's about taking that idea and then figuring out the essence of it and how you can then apply it. So do you feel like a lot of
Exactly.
bio inspiration is sort of viewing that essence and then trying to figure out what of that essence works and then how can you shift it into what you need to see?
Exactly. It's basically this transfer, this
Yeah.
thought transfer, idea transfer, rather than carbon copying.
Yeah. But I was curious to see, is there any sort of, obviously with a lot of biodiversity that has been going down because of a lot of our impact on the environment, has there been that sort of concern that there's a lot of potential biomimetic sources of inspiration that are going to disappear before we can ever see them?
Absolutely. It's a very interesting question. I've been at a conference. Well, I attended the same one online this year, but 2 years ago in 2018, that conference still took place, you know, with people attending.
Yeah.
And there was one talk by a scientist who actually mentioned we don't even have enough time to document and analyze all those different species that die every single day. So
Yeah.
there's a huge knowledge base that's disappearing before we're actually able to see how it was able to survive in its environment.
Yeah.
So that concern definitely exists. I remember a very inspiring talk, a very, very interesting talk that I heard at the conference there. So this is definitely of concern. And I mean, one thing, if you work in that field, is me as that chemical engineer working at McGill University. I'm not going out to, I don't know, Mongolia to
Yeah.
collect species A or B and then put it under the microscope and try to figure it out.
Yeah.
Very often this is where we take whatever the biologists have figured out already and we try to apply it to the engineering problems. So there's also this problem of communication, because
Yeah.
something might have been already figured out by biologists and published in biological journals, just that if I read that, I hardly understand anything, because
Yeah.
all those Latin names for the species and what they do doesn't really fall into the vocabulary that I usually use, I'm familiar with. And so it's a bit of this interdisciplinarity and those barriers that come in there. Now, if at the same time species start disappearing, questions that I might have regarding a specific species, specific finding might not be possible to resolve anymore because the species isn't there anymore. So another researcher might not be able to come back. So that is definitely of concern in the field. And I guess there's nothing else to do than trying to preserve as much as possible.
I see that you're currently involved in POW. Is there any particular reason why that sort of experience or that involvement is important to you? Or I'm just curious to see where that comes from.
Oh, I think that comes from my very first years at McGill. where, as a young female professor, I've been addressed by students if I didn't want to get involved. So then once you're involved, you stay kind of within them. I have not interacted a lot recently, definitely with COVID and everything.
Yeah.
Things have reduced there, I think, in chemical engineering. So as a message to the female chemical engineers, we're fairly, there's a good gender equilibrium overall, I'd say. But I guess like in many disciplines, there's always a bit of a prejudice against women, technology, and so on. I've experienced it myself at international conferences. Like personally, I hate to go to physics conferences in Europe. It's getting a bit better. The more gray hair I have, the better it gets. But
it's sad that that's even a conversation, though.
But it is. So that being said, as a young, new assistant professor, I remember terrible conferences where I went and I was hardly regarded as someone existing there because it was an all men's club domain. After you've been there for a couple of years, people start to know you and start to recognize you. But it's a bit of an intimidating experience. And I think that many of the girls in the field of engineering in general and sciences as well, physics alike, make that experience sooner or later. So it's, I think, something you just have to develop a bit of robustness and then trying to change things from within.
Thank you so much for being willing to do this with us.
Absolutely no problem. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Check out the Chess Facebook page to know when the next episode comes out. Until then, like and subscribe to our YouTube. Bye.